Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Dr. Maisha, and we're on another episode of the Black Mind Garden Alive podcast. And it's been a while since I have gone live and wanted to, just say that during the summertime, we have to take a few breaks. This is part of our self care strategy. And so, as we are currently on a podcasting break, I still will do some lives. And for those of you who are listening on the replay, who are listening in our season 4, we're actually getting ready to go into season 4 of the podcast. This we'll be changing up the format just a little bit in the 4th season. So stay tuned as I'm creating and thinking about how the format will shift a little bit and how I release um, podcasts and versus the live streams that I do might shift up a little bit as well. But moving on, and for those of you who don't know about the podcast, I do invite you to go ahead and find the Black Mind Garden on your podcast platform. But these are for the people who are listening live today, listening on the replay on the various social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. Go ahead and find the Black Mind Garden and go ahead and subscribe, because that way you will have sort of an evergreen library of these topics. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about resistance and hesitation, and specifically from the lens of how, when we experience resistance and when we experience hesitation, we don't always look at it through the lens of trauma. Oftentimes, when we are experiencing in conversation the space of resistance and hesitation, we take it personally. And, it can live like, what is wrong with me? Or why don't they trust me? Or why don't they, it could live in these various spaces. Why can't they trust the process? Or why are they questioning me? Right. So I was in a conversation recently, and this conversation was specific around, um, this conversation was specific around with one of my organizations that I consult with my partner, and we were just talking through some strategies and brainstorming some different ideas to navigate some of the roadblocks, anticipated roadblocks that we could come up against. And we were also presenting ideas for new programming coming up, and things, some new programming that we had been asked to do. So we were like, just brainstorming back and forth. And in that conversation, one of the participants in that meeting, that there was some hesitation, there was some resistance. Now, well, here's what I'll say. There was hesitation that occurred like resistance. So I'm going to be very specific with my words around this, because the hesitation occurred like resistance to some, and uh, occurred like just simple questions to others, right, in the room. And so, um, when hesitation comes up, a lot of times there's some meaning that is made of that hesitation when we're in the room with in a meeting, and someone is needing a moment to think about something, or asking more questions might feel like resistance to some. This is how this can show up in rooms, in meetings, right? Or if you're speaking to someone and they're not an immediate, like you're speaking to someone personally, like a spouse or a friend, and you ask them um, a question, or you ask them for something, and it's not immediate, like resounding, automatic yes, right? Then that can also show up or feel like resistance, or feel like hesitation, and it can feel very personal. But here's the thing: resistance and hesitation may not be personal at all. It may simply be a time a person needs to process, and the hesitation may be something that a person is feeling, and they may not identify it as, like, oh, it's something I'm feeling in my body, but it's some signal that comes up that is indicating to them that they need to take a moment to process or think. So I'm going to start with people who process, who take a little bit longer to process. Now, as a lot of times, I talk about the introvert versus the extrovert. And one of the characteristics of a person who tests introvert or who is a self-proclaimed introvert is that we need time to process answers. When we're being asked questions, we need time to process those answers, right? And I will share, for me, when I was in medical school, and for those of you who are listening who are physicians can relate to this, when you were asked a question on the spot, and I'm sure this is not isolated to the medical profession, when you're asked a question, when you're in training and you're asked a question on the spot, if you can't like rapid fire the answer, then you're penalized for that. And you could be penalized in any number of ways: verbally abusive comments, or aggressive comments, condescending, disparaging comments. And so what that does is it creates anxiety inside of the individual. And I could share that personally for me, right? And so then, we work to try to modify to be able to do that. However, and I know that we've talked about trauma response being the freeze as being one of those. So there's the fight, flight, freeze, feign, and fatigue response. And so what can happen is that over time, that can create toxic stress, that can create a lot of trauma in a person who's been attacked for not being able to answer a question right away. And so when you start to look at hesitation and resistance and pushback from a different lens, what we can see is that sometimes hesitation or resistance can actually be, in fact, a little bit of an activation response. And sometimes, again, it's just processing. So for myself, whenever I'm speaking with someone and they ask me a question, when I resist the urge to need to feel like I have to spout out a yes or a no, it's just let me process this for a moment. It takes a moment for me to think about it, and then I can process an answer. People who are more on the extroverted side, they tend to be able to process very a little bit quicker their answer because it sits there right on the surface, and then they can say what they say. But people who are more on the introverted side, our answers are a little bit deeper. So that's one reason why you may see hesitation, and where you may see even a little resistance, because a person, so where you see hesitation may be processing, but where you might see resistance is when you're pressing a person who needs more time. You're pressing them for answers. You're pressing them. You're bringing in that sense of urgency, and that's where you might actually meet resistance. And so as I'm in the room with this, in this meeting with this group of people, and we're presenting these ideas, on the one hand, the questions coming back may occur like resistance to some, because it occurs like, why are you asking all these questions? Or why don't you just say yes? Or why can't you trust the process? Or what is it about us that you don't trust, or us as experts that you don't trust? And it's not necessarily that. Sometimes, in order to be able to process an answer, people need more information. And so that again, asking questions can be perceived as hesitation and resistance, or it can be perceived as this person just needs more information, or they're trying to make it make sense to them, or they're trying to, whatever they're trying to do. The other place that hesitation and resistance can indicate, or the thing it can indicate, and especially in the case of this particular meeting, is that when people are considering multiple parties in their decision making, when they have multiple parties to consider in their decision making, when a person's inner people pleaser comes up, then that can actually create that hesitation because, again, processing in their mind, they may be thinking about all the things that can go wrong. And if they have been, again, once again, penalized in some way, form, or fashion before, when there's one misstep, then that over time, that happening over and over time can actually be, can create trauma. And so we have to begin to listen people differently. I always talk about when I refer back to my TEDx talk, like I talk about the filters and the filters that we speak through, but also the filters that we listen through. And when we begin to really um, show up listening through a different lens, then we can see that what appears to be one thing may just be appearing to be that thing to us and may not actually be that thing. What appears to be resistance or hesitation may not be resistance and hesitation. Or if it is resistance and hesitation, there may be something underneath that. And what there is to do is to lean into that and begin to be curious. So curiosity opens the conversation. And sometimes inside of our own meaning making of what resistance and hesitation can mean, we become activated. And again, this is something to notice about yourself. This is something to notice, like when someone is asking a whole bunch of questions, or if someone is saying, give me a moment, let me think about it, or I don't know. When I don't know comes up, when you ask them, when you're presenting something, what does that bring up in you? Does that bring up resistance in you? Does that bring up an activation in you? And the way, some people say, well, how do I know? Going back to feeling it in your body, like, what do you get tense in the shoulders? Do you get, do you feel tense in your body anywhere? Do you feel like a sensation in your stomach or in your chest? It could be an indication that you're getting activated based on what you could be interpreting, what the meaning of, like a resistance or a hesitation. If there is, in fact, a resistance or a hesitation, then leaning into that with curiosity, like, what specifically do you not understand, is a question that I often ask. What specifically is there hesitation around, is often a question I ask. Or I sense that there may be some hesitation or resistance. What is there something that I can, is there a question that I can answer, or is there something that you're not understanding? Leaning into that with curiosity opens the conversation. And a lot of times you'll get information about what's missing in that person's mind, such that they can make sense of whatever they need to make sense of, or the concern. If there's a concern that comes up, people's concerns, we want, when we have a concern, we want our concerns to be held as, and to be held as valid concerns, whether or not they're actually valid. We want to be heard and held as, okay, this is a valid concern. Let me answer that question. So we want to be mindful as we are listening to others. And when that resistance and that hesitation comes up in them, leaning into, what is the concern? What is the misunderstanding or the lack of understanding? And leaning into that with curiosity. Because when we do that, then again, it deepens the rapport between you and the person, and they're more likely to be honest about what's really going on that's causing whatever this thing that occurs, like hesitation and resistance, is that you're seeing. And then you can resolve the issue in communication. And I think that's a lot of what happens, and what is lacking and what is missing when it comes to conflict, or the intensities of conversation, or misunderstandings, is that when there's resistance and hesitation, oftentimes people get very activated inside of, oh, what does this mean? And it makes it mean something. And then instead of leaning into the curiosity of it, they either retract or they give a counter resistance. And if you're just giving counter resistance, that actually doesn't work. I mean, you can through brute force cause things to happen, and there's an impact, there's a consequence to that. So when you sort of lean into the resistance, or like sort of like a circular motion in kung fu, um, we talk about this, like utilizing in Tai Chi, utilizing the energy rather than resisting the energy. So rather than resisting the resistance, right? If you resist the resistance and there's just two people resisting the hesitation, like hesitating leads to, it's like the opposite ends of two magnets, which push each other apart. There's no communicating happening there. Leaning into and utilizing that as a utilizing the resistance and the hesitation as a indicator, as an opportunity for learning, as opportunity to deepen the conversation. So these are some of the really easy language tools that you can begin to use. So again, what is it that I sense resistance? Is there something that you don't understand, or what specifically do you not understand? Or I sense hesitation. What is it that's missing that has you feel, is that what I'm seeing? And it could be that the person's like, oh no, there's no hesitation. I'm just processing, right? When we observe something and then we name what we're seeing, right? I sense hesitation. Is that what's going on? Or is that just me? Oh, no, no, I'm just processing. Or, oh, yeah, there's a little hesitation. This is what I'm thinking of, or this is the concern. Or if a person keeps pushing back on something that you're presenting or asking, they're pushing back. Oh, I sense this resistance. What's that about? Like, what can what's the resistance about? Is there something I'm not explaining well, or, whatever, right? And then they'll usually will it'll actually will make them aware of how their communication is landing. And that's another thing that is very, very powerful about naming, is that when you actually begin to name what you're observing, sometimes the person it doesn't occur for the person that that's what's happening. So when you name, oh, I sense some resistance happening, then the person can be like, oh, am I resisting? Or, oh yeah, you know what, I there is resistance here. This is what this is about, right? And then you can, again, you're leaning into it, utilizing that energy as an opportunity to go deeper into the conversation and to open the conversation and really discover what's happening that is having there not be um, an alignment, right, in the communication. And oftentimes when you begin to listen for what is missing in the conversation that would have there be alignment, and you start to like really ask the question, like, what's the common goal, coming back to the big picture. I am a very big picture person, and as much as the work that I do in consulting and the work that I do in training, it requires some of the details. I always like to, because there's a lot of details in communication, and especially in trauma informed communication. When I teach my NLP trainings, there's a ton, like in that week of foundational training and the 2 weeks of the mastery training, there's a lot of information, detailed information that people get to going towards that certification. And what happens is when you pan out to the big picture occasionally, then people say, oh, this is where this fits in. So when you're in conversation with a person and you're presenting these ideas and you start to notice yourself get down into the weeds in the conversation, or there's resistance and there's hesitation, then when you start to chunk it back up to the big picture and you say, oh, you know what, let's bring it back to the big picture. What's the common goal? What's the common value that we're looking at here? What's important here is, that's a way to chunk up. Okay, so let's bring it back. What's important is this, or let's bring it back. What we're trying to accomplish is here. And when you bring it back up to the bigger picture, then again, you can start to open the conversation into the details. Okay, so this is the bigger picture. Now, what we're talking about inside of that bigger picture is this, this part that's in the details. How do we match those details so that we achieve the bigger picture? And that's, some of the that comes from the listening. That comes from the observing your own activation, observing your own responses and reactions, and leaning into what feels like a resistance or a hesitation. So at the end of the day, in the meeting, as the questions were asked, I could really hear that there was processing happening. There was more information that needed to be given, and that's what we did. We had a wonderful conversation, and I was able to sort of like really chunk up to here's the common denominator. Here's what I hear you asking me. What is it that you're concerned about? Here's what are some suggestions. What do you think about that to bridge the gap between what we were saying and what you feel like is needed? We were able to come back and really resolve the incongruency and the hesitation and move toward a solution. And of course, some things like, some of the things couldn't be decided on in that day. So it's like sometimes it's giving permission not to have to decide right now, right? So if there's a hesitation, it's like, okay, here are the options, because sometimes things will not be resolved in that moment, and forcing that resolution in the moment is bringing in sense of urgency. So when we say, okay, maybe this is something that can't be 100% resolved, here are the issues, right? This doesn't have to be resolved today. Here are the options. Let's sleep on it. Let's think about it. Let's communicate. Let's revisit in our next meeting. But sometimes when you lean into that resistance and that hesitation, and you chunk people up and you find that common value, you will notice that the resolution will come much quicker. So, with that said, I invite you to really begin to notice when you're in conversation with people, when there's hesitation and when there's resistance. I invite you to notice first what comes up in you, and then remind yourself that all hesitation and resistance doesn't mean what you think it means. And then number two, so that's what this is number one, right? I always give you practices to go and do in the world. So when you're listening and you're talking with someone and their resistance comes up in them, you feel it, like it occurs like resistance or it occurs like hesitation. Notice first what comes up in you. What are you making that mean, right? And then remember, not everything is as it seems. Number two, name it. Okay, this is kind of like what I'm feeling or what I'm seeing. Is that what's going on? Always clarify. When you go in with you're resisting, or I see your hesitation, you're mind reading. So you say, well, this is what I'm sensing. Is that what's happening? Right? Clarify. And when you clarify, they'll say either yes, it's happening, no, something else is happening, or no, I'm just processing. No, it's nothing. I'm good. And then lean into the resistance with curiosity. All right, those are the three things you're going to practice. And I invite you to share with me how it goes. And if you find this conversation valuable, this podcast, share it, because we are often dealing with resistance. I mean, there's so much resistance that we're dealing with in the world. And when we can learn to deal with it like at an individual level and really, I think that part of why there's a lot of failure in moving the Titanic of some of these major movements and major initiatives is because the individual people sort of uh, are lacking in the the capacity, or not remembering, or just lacking the willingness to first look at what's going on in me, and examining what are my own filters, and then leaning into. So some people will examine themselves, but that's not necessarily be willing to lean into and name what's going on. And it takes something. It takes courage. It takes moving through whatever our own conversations are around that. And sometimes for some of us who do a lot of that, there's fatigue, especially in marginalized populations and people of color who are always sort of working against resistance. There can be fatigue, and there could be this tendency to just be like, "Look, I'm tired. I shouldn't have to do this all the time." And you're right, we shouldn't. And if there are more empowering ways to be able to manage people, to utilize their energy rather than to push against it, to navigate the resistance in more of a uh, what's the word I want to use? Like in the way in a martial artist type of way, then why not lean into those skills and tools? And that's exactly a lot of what I teach in organizations when I teach the trauma informed communication. In fact, um, pretty soon, I think I shared this in our last uh, in the last live in the last podcast that I'm going to be launching a course, trauma informed communication online course, and it'll be, sort of targeted for the individual, but also for organizations who want their leadership and their um, staff, managers, directors to learn, to go deeper in learning some really useful communication tools, and to learn a little bit more about how trauma impacts our beliefs, behavior, communication, and what to do with that, and how to like start to really create different culture in your organizations by learning these tools. Again, most of you know that uh, I do work in anti-racism. I do anti-racism training and advisory work with my partner, Dr. Jill Weiner. And a major part of what we teach is those skill sets, bridging the gap between learning that there is bias, learn and how to manage that in communication. So with that being said, stay tuned. If you go on the website now, actually, you can see the components of the trauma informed communication course. But stay tuned for the big launch. It's coming up soon. Um, so you've got your three things to go. If you want to know more about the certification trainings that I run, the NLP coach certifications that I run, you can go to the website. I'm going to, let's see, put the website here up on the screen. Here you go. There you go. And so if you want to learn more about the either the organizational speaking that I do, the training that I do, or if you want to learn about the individual trainings, communication trainings that I do, you may go to mindremappingacademy.com. Mindremappingacademy.com. It's right here on the screen if you're watching the video. And it'll be in the show notes as well for those of you who are listening to the audio podcast later. And you can schedule a call with me and learn a little bit more about how it could benefit you or your organization. And once again, like I invite you to share this episode and share this podcast with at least one other person, because I think it could be useful for people to really look at resistance and hesitation through another lens, through the lens of trauma, through the lens of, another filter. Okay, so with that said, I will bid you adieu, and you all have a great rest of the day and a wonderful rest of the week. Bye now.